Witchfinders or mass murderers. Between 1645 and 1647, Matthew Hopkins, the self-titled Witchfinder General, and John Stearne led a murderous campaign across East Anglia, England, resulting in the executions of around 300 people, mainly women. This single 18-month hunt accounted for as many witch trial deaths as the previous 160 years of English history. Their first act as witchfinders occurred in the county of Essex, which in the previous 100 years had held more witch trials than any other, and maintained an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia. In March 1645, Stearne claimed that a local group of women, including Elizabeth Clark, was practising witchcraft and had targeted him. Stearne approached local magistrate Sir Harbottle Grimston and obtained a warrant granting him authorisation to search and examine suspects. Once Stearne secured the warrant, Hopkins volunteered to assist in watching and interrogating. Elizabeth Clark was an elderly, impoverished and disabled woman. Torture was illegal in England, so Hopkins used a method called watching. Clark was forced to sit on a high stool in the middle of a room and kept awake for several days and nights without food. Hopkins claimed that if a witch were watched long enough, her familiars would come to her for a meal. Exhausted and hallucinating, Clark claimed to have made a pact with the devil, and in his later pamphlet, A Discovery of Witches, Hopkins states she named her imps as they appeared in the room. Jamara, a fat white dog. Vinegar Tom, a long-legged greyhound with the head of an ox. Sack and Sugar, a shaggy black rabbit. News, a polecat. Holt, a white kitten. Clark didn't just confess, she implicated others, was found guilty and was hanged shortly after. Stearne and Hopkins used this case to launch careers as professional witchfinders, travelling town to town seeking paid contracts to rid communities of so-called witches. But what made witch hunting so desirable? Hopkins was the son of a strict Puritan minister and grew up with an apocalyptic worldview. Puritans of the era believed that they were living in the end of times and that the devil was actively waging war against them. They carried copies of King James's book Demonology and argued that their mission was to uncover those who had made pacts with Satan. Hopkins was also potentially suffering from tuberculosis during his hunts and may have been driven by a frantic desire to secure his own place in heaven by cleansing society of perceived evil before his own death. Financially, witch hunting was incredibly well paid. Despite claiming to only charge enough to maintain their horses and associates, records show massive fees. In Ipswich, the costs were so significant that the town had to levy a special local tax just to pay them. In 1645, Hopkins was in his mid-20s, unmarried and without a clear career path or steady income. Unlike Stearne, he had little social status of his own. Witch hunting offered Hopkins an immediate ladder to authority. By becoming the Witchfinder General, he created himself a legitimate-sounding title. Stearne was about 10 years older than Hopkins, married with a young child and a property owner. He was a man of recognised local standing who had a history of getting involved in legal disputes. Unlike Hopkins, Stearne never took on the title Witchfinder General, instead acting out of desire to protect his existing household, local standing and community from what he perceived as demonic threats, and probably money and power. During the English Civil War of 1642 to 1651, the courts were disrupted as judges struggled to travel outside of London. In their absence, local magistrates, often radical Puritans, were left to handle law and order. This allowed witchfinders to operate in a way that they wouldn't have got away with otherwise. As radical Puritans, the pair also used the hunts to suit their personal motives. One of their victims was John Lawes, a 70-year-old Anglican vicar who had served his parish for 50 years. Hopkins had him watched, until he confessed to sending imp familiars to sink a ship. Lawes was hanged at Bury St Edmunds and had to recite his own burial service because no Anglican clergyman was allowed to officiate. One of the practices Hopkins is most notorious is the infamous swimming test, binding an accused person's thumbs to their toes and lowering them into the water. If they floated, the water, considered a holy element, was rejecting them as a witch. If they sank, they were innocent. In his later The Discovery of Witches pamphlet, Hopkins denied using the swimming test, calling it unreliable and unchristian. This was due to public and legal backlash against it, ruining his credibility. Hopkins and Stearne caused the death of around 300 people in just 2 years. Their downfall came when Vicar John Gall questioned their authority and use of torture. In 1646, Gall published his Scaling Critique, select cases of conscience touching witches and witchcrafts, challenging their motives and methods on several religious, legal and practical grounds. Gall argued that Hopkins and Stearne had no legitimate judicial authority to act as self-appointed judges, jury, or executioners. They were private individuals operating for profit. He accused them of coercion, specifically physical and psychological torture like sleep deprivation, forced pacing, and the swimming test. Because torture was illegal under English common law, Gall argued that confessions produced through hallucination and sheer exhaustion were fraudulent and unreliable. Gall was a conservative Anglican minister. He accused East Anglian villagers of putting more faith in the Witchfinder General than in God or the Scriptures. When Hopkins and Stearne began to operate in his parish, Gall visited the women detained for himself to hear their side of the story. Seeing firsthand the state of the accused convinced him that the pair were forcing manufactured confessions from vulnerable individuals. Once the regular legal system began to stabilise toward the end of the 1640s, the Witchfinder General title was scrutinised, their fees were seen as extortion, and they were pushed into retirement. In an attempt to defend his actions, Hopkins published The Discovery of Witches in 1647. He died later that year, likely of tuberculosis. There are some urban myths that suggest he was subjected to his own swimming test, which shows how disliked he was by the time he died. Stearne retreated to his farm in Lawshore, Suffolk. Facing fierce public criticism for his role in the executions, he published his own defence pamphlet in 1648, titled A Confirmation and Discovery of Witchcraft. Like Hopkins' pamphlet, it detailed their methods, costs, and justifications. Unfortunately, the profession didn't die with them. Shortly after Hopkins' death, a large witch hunt broke out in Scotland. From this arose common prickers, who claimed that they could use long brass pins to prick the accused and find witches' marks, spots on the body insensitive to pain. After hearing of the success in Scotland, Newcastle officials hired a Scottish pricker to clear their jails. The pricker, recorded historically as Scotchman, was paid 20 shillings per witch. He identified 30 women, 15 were hanged. However, he was also found to be a fraud, using retractable needles, and fled back to Scotland where he was arrested, and before his own execution confessed to being responsible for the deaths of over 220 women across England and Scotland. Witch hunts didn't end overnight. As society entered the Enlightened Age and scientific revolution, new discoveries and understandings brought about human reason and skepticism. The Enlightenment challenged and began to change the worldview that had sustained the witch hunts for centuries. These fraudulent revelations would have been a turning point, and after over a century of murder, paranoia and superstition were superseded with common sense. Understanding why the British witch hunts happened teaches us important lessons. Witches were normal people. By figuring out how fear and false information turn them into scapegoats, we can spot those issues in society today. Charities like Advocacy for Alleged Witches are working to end all forms of human rights abuses linked to witchcraft allegations in African countries, and you can find out more about their work on their website. Between the 16th and 18th centuries in Britain, up to 3,000 people are estimated to have been executed for alleged witchcraft. The dark reality, of course, is that almost everyone killed was innocent, yet their murder was completely legal. In Part 3, we'll be talking to the British Witchcraft Act, its origin, its legacy, and its more recent application in modern society.